Naughty Dog used to be untouchable. For years, they weren't just a developer, they were the developer, the gold standard, the prestige studio that could drop jaws with a single trailer and sweep award seasons without breaking a sweat. If Sony were a kingdom, Naughty Dog sat on the throne, but somewhere between The Last of Us and whatever it is that they're working on now, something shifted, because lately, the name Naughty Dog doesn't spark excitement, it sparks arguments. Cancelled projects, controversial hires, AI story pitches, and a leadership team that seems more interested in managing perception than actually making games. Something has gone horribly wrong, because this isn't just a fall from grace, it's a studio in freefall, and the signs have been there for years. Today we're pulling it all together, the timeline, the turning points, and why one of gaming's most beloved developers now finds itself at the centre of its own prestige implosion. I am Lady Decade, hit that subscribe button because today we're going to be discussing why Naughty Dog generates so much outrage. Let's be honest, a lot of Western games these days feel more like marketing strategies than actual creative works. Bloated budgets, focus-tested nonsense, and storylines that feel like they were written by HR departments, but thankfully, you don't have to pay 70 quid to be disappointed. Using my affiliate link down below, you can grab actual quality titles, many from studios that still remember how to make games for players and not shareholders, for up to 90% off. We're talking big discounts on hits like Stellar Blade, Black Myth Wukong, Expedition 33, and even 32% off beautiful projects that are about to be released, such as the visually stunning Wu Chang. So check out the bargains, support the channel while you save, and spend your money on something that doesn't make you feel like you're beta testing a brand. Cheers! For nearly 2 decades, Naughty Dog could do no wrong. From the mischievous charm of Crash Bandicoot, to the adventurous wit of Uncharted, to the emotionally gut-wrenching Last of Us series, this was a developer that seemed to age gracefully alongside its audience. As the gaming industry matured, so did Naughty Dog, evolving from mascot platformers to prestige, narrative-driven blockbusters that dominated the Game Awards and headlined Sony's marketing campaigns. By the early 2020s, The Last of Us wasn't just a game, it was a brand synonymous with serious storytelling in games. The studio's reputation became one of carefully curated artistry, grounded characters, flawless animations, award-winning direction, and a deep commitment to craft. If a game had the Naughty Dog logo on the box, you knew it was going to set a new technical benchmark and probably spark 1,000 discourse threads on whether it had just elevated the medium. But in 2024 and 2025, something changed. Actually, several things changed, and fast. Today, when you say the name Naughty Dog, you're just as likely to be met with a raised eyebrow as you are with reverence. Online forums are full of exasperated fans. Press coverage has shifted from celebratory to defensive. Even long-time PlayStation loyalists are starting to ask what exactly is going on over there. From leadership shifts and failed projects to reputation mismanagement, media deflection, and one very loud new hire, we'll explore how Naughty Dog's glow dimmed and why that matters beyond just Twitter noise. Because at its core, this isn't a story about outrage, it's a story about trust. About how a studio once regarded as a creative North Star now feels like a PR-managed artifact, and as we'll see, that didn't just happen overnight, but it did happen publicly. And what's better is we've got receipts, so let's go back to the beginning. After making their mark on the original PlayStation with Crash Bandicoot and carrying that momentum into the PS2 era with Jak and Daxter, Naughty Dog underwent a quiet reinvention in the mid-2000s. Out went the cartoon mascots and exaggerated platforming. In came something far more ambitious. Uncharted: Drake's Fortune. Released in 2007, Uncharted marked the beginning of the studio's now signature style, a blend of tightly scripted storytelling, motion-captured performances, and narrative momentum that felt more like Hollywood than Hyrule. At the heart of this transformation was Amy Hennig, the creative director and writer behind the first 3 Uncharted games. Under her leadership, Naughty Dog struck a rare balance between pulpy blockbuster flair and grounded, character-driven storytelling. Nathan Drake wasn't just a wise-cracking treasure hunter, he had vulnerability, charisma, and a beating heart. The games were funny, fast-paced, and emotionally engaging without ever tipping into self-importance, which at the time felt almost radical. So nothing to complain about there. This era also saw a massive leap forward in technical prowess. The jump from Uncharted 1 to Uncharted 2 Among Thieves in 2009 was seismic. IGN hailed it as a video game that will be remembered for years, adding that it sets a new standard for what is possible in interactive storytelling. Eurogamer's Tom Bramwell went even further, calling it the best game I've played this year and perhaps this generation. The praise wasn't just glowing, it was historic. Uncharted 2 didn't just win awards, it became a new benchmark for what cinematic games could aspire to be. But by the time Uncharted 3 launched in 2011, Naughty Dog had quietly split into two internal teams, a structural change that would pave the way for their most ambitious project yet. In 2013, the second team released The Last of Us, the now iconic post-apocalyptic action drama that traded treasure hunts for emotional trauma. Co-directed by Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley, The Last of Us took the cinematic foundations of Uncharted and reworked them into something bleaker, bolder, and far more emotionally raw. Joel and Ellie's journey through a crumbling America struck a nerve with audiences and critics. Polygon's Justin McElroy called it not just the best game Naughty Dog has ever made, it may be the best game of this entire console generation. Edge magazine, rarely known for excessive praise, simply called it a masterpiece, marveling at how it was this violent, this bleak, and yet so deeply human. So, The Last of Us didn't just elevate Naughty Dog, it canonized them. Suddenly, the studio was considered more than just a great developer. This was PlayStation's prestige studio, the HBO of gaming, the ones who could make you cry during a cutscene and then win a BAFTA for it. From that point forward, every project would carry the weight of cultural expectation, artistic scrutiny, and narrative reverence. In short, this was Naughty Dog at its creative peak, fearless, dominant, and, to most observers, untouchable. Naughty Dog's golden era didn't end with a dramatic flop or a PR catastrophe, at least not at first. It began with a quiet shake-up behind the scenes, one that would subtly reshape the studio's creative identity and internal culture for years to come. In early 2014, news broke that Amy Hennig, the creative force behind the Uncharted trilogy, had left Naughty Dog after more than a decade at the studio. Sony issued a brief, non-committal statement thanking her for her contributions, but the circumstances surrounding her exit were far from transparent. Jason Schreier reported at the time that Hennig had been forced out by Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley, the duo fresh off their success directing The Last of Us. Naughty Dog publicly denied the claim, but the story sparked unease within the industry, raising questions about internal politics and a possible power struggle. What wasn't in dispute was the change in direction. With Hennig gone, Druckmann and Straley assumed full creative control over Uncharted 4, A Thief's End, inheriting a project already in development and rebuilding it almost entirely. Naturally, the tone shifted. The swashbuckling energy and high-flying pulp of the earlier games gave way to heavier themes, legacy, regret, and family dysfunction, all presented through a more somber, introspective lens. But did these changes garner any different reactions from previously? The final result, released in 2016, was a triumph by most metrics. Uncharted 4 was a commercial hit and a critical darling. The New York Times' Chris Suellentrop remarked that the most surprising thing about Uncharted 4 is not the action, but the restraint, calling it the closest thing we've had to a Terrence Malick action movie. For many, this new tone was a sign of maturity. For others, it marked a turning point, the moment Naughty Dog traded charm for for solemnity and began actively chasing prestige. Behind the scenes, the transformation was even more pronounced. The studio had always been known for its perfectionism, but with rising expectations came rising pressure. Veteran staff quietly exited. Development cycles grew more intense, and while the public wouldn't hear the full story until much later, the roots of Naughty Dog's notorious crunch culture were already in place. Developers later told Schreier that crunch didn't begin with The Last of Us Part 2. It was already entrenching during Uncharted 4, driven by the need to deliver blockbuster spectacle with art house emotional depth. This was the beginning of what might be called the prestige trap. The more praise Naughty Dog received, the more it seemed determined to outdo itself, not just in gameplay or visuals, but in emotional gravitas, moral complexity, and cinematic polish. The studio still made exceptional games, but something had shifted. The humour was drying up. The space for experimentation was shrinking, and the collaborative spirit that had once defined the studio was starting to coalesce around a single, increasingly influential figure. That figure was, of course, Neil Druckmann, but as we'll see in the next chapter, his ascent wouldn't just change the games, it would reshape the backlash. By the time Uncharted 4 wrapped development, Naughty Dog's transformation into a prestige studio was complete, but maintaining that image would prove far more costly than earning it. What followed wasn't just a troubled production cycle, it was the moment the cracks in the Naughty Dog mythos began to show publicly. Development on The Last of Us Part 2 began in earnest after the release of Uncharted: The Lost Legacy in 2017. Neil Druckmann, now firmly installed as the studio's creative figurehead, took over as sole director, with co-director Bruce Straley having quietly departed a year earlier. The sequel was framed as Naughty Dog's most ambitious project yet, a sprawling, emotionally complex, narratively audacious follow-up to one of the most acclaimed games of the previous decade. Internally, however, the process was anything but smooth. In March 2020, just months before launch, Jason Schreier published an extensive exposé titled "The Human Cost of Making The Last of Us Part 2. The article detailed a studio gripped by perfectionism and plagued by long hours, miscommunication, and a culture of crunch that had led to widespread burnout and staff churn. The managers at Naughty Dog seemed to have the best intentions, Schreier wrote, but good intentions didn't save their employees from overwork. More than a dozen developers told me that while the game may be excellent, it's the result of a broken process. The report painted a picture of a studio trapped by its own high standards. Developers spoke of redrawing entire levels from scratch, animating microscopic facial expressions, and rewriting key scenes late into production, all under pressure to live up to the Naughty Dog legacy. Veteran staff left. Junior developers struggled to keep pace. Even those proud of the final product described the process as unsustainable. Externally, though, the studio's prestige remained intact. The marketing machine was well-oiled, hype was high, but behind the curtains, Naughty Dog was bleeding talent and burning through its goodwill. When The Last of Us Part 2 finally released in June of 2020, critics responded with a tidal wave of acclaim. It won many Game of the Year awards and swept nearly every major outlet. The Guardian called it a generation-defining masterpiece. IGN gave it a perfect 10. The accolades came fast and from every direction. Among players, however, the response was far more divided. Some praised its narrative ambition and emotional scope. Others were alienated by its structure, pacing and tone. The mid-game character switch, the brutal story beats, the bleak world view. For many, it felt less like a game and more like a statement, and not one they necessarily agreed with. Metacritic was bombarded with review bombs. Social media exploded into a proxy war, not over mechanics or visuals, but over meaning. Even those who loved the game found themselves asking uncomfortable questions. Was the studio still collaborative or increasingly insular? Was perfectionism a virtue or a sign of managerial tunnel vision? Whatever the answer, The Last of Us Part 2 marked a shift. The surface polish remained, the awards piled up, but underneath, the foundation had begun to crack. And those cracks would only deepen in the years ahead. Following the divisive reception of The Last of Us Part 2, Naughty Dog entered a quieter phase, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that was happening became increasingly curated. Gone were the behind-the-scenes blog posts, the wide-ranging media interviews, and the candid peeks into development that once made the studio feel approachable. In their place, controlled, internally produced content like Grounded 2, making The Last of Us Part 2, a documentary where every key decision was filtered through the lens of the creative leads, where critique was conspicuously absent. The studio's evolving communications strategy didn't go unnoticed. Naughty Dog wasn't just crafting prestige games anymore, it was crafting prestige mythology. And the central figure in that mythology inevitably was, of course, Neil Druckmann. After declaring his own work with grandiose narcissism as the greatest story ever told in video games, Neil Druckmann didn't just pat himself on the back, he practically dislocated his shoulder. A bold claim, especially for a game where you can die face first in a puddle after forgetting to press triangle. But more than just a self-congratulatory, the quote underscored how Naughty Dog had begun to frame its own legacy. Internally validated, self-authored, and increasingly unchallenged. It's a kind of thing that you'd expect from someone who likely gives himself standing ovations in the mirror. Instead of engaging widely with the press, the studio turned inward, offering hand-picked interviews and showcasing projects through its own carefully controlled platforms. As The Guardian noted in 2023 when discussing the future of The Last of Us franchise, there is a sense that Naughty Dog, once the industry's most transparent AAA studio, has grown increasingly siloed, selectively engaging with outlets it knows will reflect the message it wants to send. This was especially evident during the long quiet lead up to the now cancelled Factions multiplayer project. Information trickled out through cautious statements and studio blog posts, while questions around delays, direction and viability were left unanswered, leaving fans to speculate and journalists largely in the dark. Even Druckmann himself acknowledged this shift in a 2023 interview with BuzzFeed. We've had to rethink how much we say and when we say it. Sometimes the story we're trying to tell can get lost when too many people are trying to tell it for us. That statement, while understandable from a PR perspective, also signals something deeper, a studio increasingly uncomfortable with outside scrutiny. Critique, once embraced as part of the creative process, was now treated as a liability, and Naughty Dog, once beloved for its openness, began to feel more like a gated compound than a collaborative studio. In short, Naughty Dog wasn't just making stories anymore, it was managing one. Off the screen, about itself. In the wake of The Last of Us Part 2 controversy, fans were promised something different from Factions, a standalone multiplayer experience building on the beloved PvP mode from the original game. First teased as far back as 2020, the project was hyped, delayed, rebranded, and eventually euthanized. The final blow came in December 2023 when Naughty Dog announced that it had made the incredibly difficult decision to stop development on The Last of Us Online. The official explanation was wrapped in PR velvet. The studio didn't want to become a purely live service developer and was instead refocusing on narrative-driven single-player experiences. An excellent direction if pursued earnestly. Behind the scenes, though, the story looked far less curated. Trouble reportedly began when Sony brought in Bungie, a studio with live service expertise, to evaluate the project. Bungie reviewed Factions and concluded that it lacked a long-term engagement potential. Naughty Dog, for their part, described the feedback as extremely helpful, which translated from corporate roughly means we had no idea what we were doing. The cancellation stung not just because the project was scrapped, but because it had been teased for years. First as a mode, then as a standalone game, then as a mysterious shadow project worth the wait. Fans endured concept art, job listings, vague blog posts, only for the entire thing to vanish with little more than a corporate shrug. The backlash was immediate and unsurprising. One Reddit user summed it up succinctly. Why even announce this stuff if it never materializes? And their frustration wasn't niche. It was the prevailing mood. After all, this wasn't an indie developer biting off more than they could chew. This was Naughty Dog, Sony's prestige powerhouse. And they'd spent years scattering breadcrumbs without ever baking the loaf. Meanwhile, internal reports suggested morale was cratering. Anonymous developer accounts described staff confidence as being at an all-time low, with some questioning the leadership's direction in the wake of factions' quiet demise. While it's normal for large projects to pivot or collapse, the studio's opacity only magnified the sense of creative drift. Instead of ushering in a bold new multiplayer era, factions became something else entirely, a symbol of Naughty Dog's post-2020 identity crisis. A studio caught between the prestige storytelling that once made it very famous and the corporate pressure to chase live service trends. In trying to do both, it did neither. By late 2024, Naughty Dog was in desperate need of a win, or at least a break from controversy. What they got instead was Mike Drucker. Mike Drucker, a comedy writer with credits at The Tonight Show and Samantha Bee, was announced as part of the writing team at Naughty Dog. On paper, it made a sort of sense. He'd worked in games media before, had penned material for Nintendo Power, and could theoretically bring a fresh perspective, but within days of the announcement, Twitter/X was on fire. And not in the good, wow, what a hire kind of way. A resurfaced tweet. Being a white man is a mental illness immediately reignited culture war discourse. Whether it was satire, irony, or just a terrible attempt at humour, the post spread like wildfire, stripped of context and served with screenshots. But the problem wasn't just the one tweet. Drucker's timeline, once excavated, revealed years of posts towing the line between punchline and political sermon, the kind of material that made some wonder if the joke was ever the point. As I noted in my old video from well over a year ago about Drucker's Stellar Blade backlash, he has become something of a walking culture war grenade, a writer who seems to keep landing prestige roles despite offering little beyond punchlines laced with ideology. For many, his hiring at Naughty Dog didn't just signal a new direction, it confirmed their very worst suspicions. After all, this was a studio already accused of losing touch with its core audience. Hiring someone whose brand revolved around moralizing one-liners felt less like a creative pivot and more like a provocation. Fans didn't just question his style, they questioned the fit. "This guy is writing The Last of Us Part 3" became a common refrain on forums and Reddit threads alike. Of course, Drucker has defenders and he's not without credentials, but the backlash wasn't about whether he could write. It was about what his hiring represented. A studio more interested in optics than output. A creative team more focused on Twitter than tension arcs. This wasn't a scandal in the traditional sense. There were no lawsuits or walkouts, but culturally, it lit the fuse on a long simmering frustration. Naughty Dog once prided itself on making players feel, but now it seemed increasingly to make content to make them argue. In May 2025, Neil Druckmann gave what should have been a routine, soft-focus interview on Sony's official blog. During the interview, Druckmann said the quiet part out loud. "What I'm most excited about are the new ways to tell stories. I'm eager to see how we can tell a story that's as compelling as our past games, but without any dialogue. With help from AI, we might get there sooner than we think." Now, in isolation, that kind of quote might sound experimental, bold, maybe even forward-thinking to a certain crowd, but coming from the man who had made his name championing character-driven, emotionally rich storytelling, it felt less like evolution and more like a creative nosedive. The backlash was instant. Fans, critics, and even some developers voiced disbelief. Had Naughty Dog, the studio that practically wrote the book on prestige narrative games, really embraced the idea of AI-written, dialogue-free, interactive art films? Sensing the growing firestorm, Druckmann posted on Twitter, claiming he had been misquoted and misunderstood. For a moment, that might have quelled the uproar. But then, Sony released the full transcript. Word for word, the quote matched. No paraphrasing, no editorial trickery. Druckmann had said exactly what people thought he said and tried to walk it back anyway. And at that point, what began as a curious statement became a PR meltdown. Even IGN, in a now infamous article titled "Neil Druckmann's Vision Was Misunderstood," again, journalist Rebecca Valentine came to his defense, claiming the quote had been taken out of context and arguing that the vision was more nuanced than critics allowed. But the internet wasn't buying it, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Naughty Dog, the studio that once prided itself on narrative clarity, was now caught flailing through a self-inflicted storytelling mess. One Redditor summed it up perfectly. It's never a good sign when the cleanup job causes more fire damage than the original spark. In the end, this wasn't just a bad quote or a botched walkback. It became emblematic of a deeper problem. Naughty Dog's leadership had stopped speaking clearly and started speaking carefully. And when even your carefully crafted message backfires this badly, it's hard not to wonder if the problem isn't communication at all, but conviction. Once hailed as a gold standard of narrative-driven gaming, Naughty Dog now stands at crossroads, or more accurately, a PR-managed roundabout. The studio that gave us Uncharted 2 and The Last of Us, games that felt personal, cinematic and groundbreaking, is now seen by many as bloated, cautious and creatively adrift. Longtime fans and industry insiders have noticed the shift. One former developer told GameFile, "There was a time when we all felt like we were working on something special, but now it just feels like everything is run through a filter." Another was more blunt. People are burnt out. The vision isn't clear anymore. It's like leadership's biggest priority is not making the next great game. It's making sure no one says the wrong thing on Twitter. Meanwhile, according to GamesIndustry.biz, even internal teams aren't always sure what the studio is working on. Christopher Dring summed it up succinctly. For a company that once prided itself on transparency and innovation, Naughty Dog has become frustratingly opaque. And that opacity has consequences, not just for hype cycles, but for trust. Because when a studio spends more time shaping its public image than communicating with its own developers, something fundamental breaks. You can film all the behind-the-scenes documentaries you want, but if the output no longer matches the myth, people will notice. In the end, the question isn't whether Naughty Dog is still talented. Of course it is, but the question is whether that talent is still being channeled into bold, creative vision, or smoothed down by corporate messaging, identity anxiety, and a deep, paralysing fear of misstep. What an absolute mess! Naughty Dog's upcoming game, Intergalactic, The Heretic Prophet, is already facing significant backlash despite only being recently unveiled. The controversy centres on a mixture of fan disillusionment, cultural pushback and tone-deaf PR choices, all unfolding before the game has a proper release date. The reveal trailer drew overwhelmingly negative reactions, with the PlayStation YouTube upload showing over 262,000 dislikes against fewer than 100,000 likes. On Naughty Dog's own version of the trailer, comments were disabled, but the like-to-dislike ratio told a similar story. Many viewers felt blindsided not by the game's content necessarily, but by how it was pitched, presented, and defended. Much of the controversy surrounds the game's protagonist, Jordan, portrayed by actress Tati Gabrielle. Her design, a bald, muscular woman, triggered widespread discourse. While many praised the character's uniqueness, others felt she represented a deliberate shift away from relatable protagonists in favour of ideological box-ticking. The backlash wasn't helped by Gabrielle herself, who responded to criticism with a "you mad bro" post on Instagram. What might have been a throwaway bit of bravado was interpreted by critics as smugness, further escalating tensions and reinforcing the perception that Naughty Dog, and by extension its cast, were mocking their own player base. This entire situation has once again dredged up comparisons to the controversy surrounding The Last of Us Part 2, with many commenters claiming Naughty Dog has learned nothing from the polarising fan response of 2020. Several Reddit threads have highlighted how players feel that they're no longer the audience that Naughty Dog is interested in serving. Instead, the studio seems more focused on making statements than making games. As one user put it, "This isn't just backlash, it's the cumulative effect of years of being told your opinion doesn't matter and then being taunted for holding it." Adding to the mess is the sheer scale of the project. Intergalactic is not just another game, it's Naughty Dog's first major new IP in over a decade. Over 250 developers are involved, and the studio has teased themes of faith, heresy, and cosmic scale storytelling. Neil Druckmann has stated that the game is being developed more like a TV show, which for fans is more red flag than reassurance. The concern isn't just that the game will be preachy, it's that it will be cold, calculated, and obsessed with spectacle over substance. And with no gameplay shown and only vague narrative hints so far, the audience is left with more questions than answers. Ultimately, Intergalactic has become a lightning rod not just for Naughty Dog's ongoing identity crisis, but for a wider cultural clash about what AAA games should be. The game might still turn out to be brilliant, but right now it's viewed by many as a symptom of everything going wrong in modern Western game development. And that is, of course, a huge problem. Naughty Dog was once a studio that earned its prestige through pulpy charm, tight design, and emotional storytelling. It's matured alongside its audience without losing its humanity, but somewhere along the way, that human touch was replaced by something colder. Something safer, more curated, and ironically, more alienating. Leadership changed, communication closed, projects collapsed, and when the backlash came, it wasn't just about ideology, it was about trust. It was about players no longer recognising the voice behind the games. This isn't the end of Naughty Dog, far from it, but the studio that once set the standard is now struggling to even speak the same language as its fans. Once the face of PlayStation's creative ambition, it now risks becoming the face of performative corporate culture. And that's the real tragedy here. But here's the good news, you don't have to fork out 70 quid just to be let down. Use my affiliate links down below and you can grab actual quality titles, many from studios that still believe in making games for players and not shareholders, for up to 90% off. That includes massive discounts on masterpieces like Stellar Blade, Black Myth, The Wukong, and Expedition 33, as well as a hefty 32% off the visually jaw-dropping upcoming titles like Wuchang Fallen Feathers. So treat yourself, support the channel while you save, and if you want to go even further, check out my behind-the-scenes cosplay library over on Patreon. You'll be helping me keep these videos coming, one ridiculous outfit at a time. So thanks everyone, and I'll see you all again soon in the next video.